Welcome back to the Tokyo Living Podcast Injury Edition. Nice to have you with us again. Today we're going to be talking about ice and more specifically the use of ice in the management of pain and injury. Now I did talk about this I believe a couple of years ago on an Ask 360 episode, but I think that there is still some misunderstanding and some misconceptions about the use of ice, and I know just personally I've had a couple of experiences in recent times where I've actually experienced my own injuries in training, and the people in that training environment, coaches and training partners, have been very quick to offer up the ice. Oh, can we get you some ice? What happened? Oh, we'll get you some ice. No, it's fine. I don't need ice. I said, no, it's fine. We've got ice. I was like, we don't need ice. So I think it's something that needs to be addressed, and because it is such an easily accessible modality, I think it's something that a lot of people will go to very quickly. And so, the more people that are educated in some of the specifics about when we should and when we perhaps shouldn't use ice, the better. Now, the use of ice from a historical perspective, I guess we can look at it in two different parts. One is from an evolutionary perspective, and the other, I guess, from more of a scientific perspective. From an evolutionary perspective, to be honest, I haven't really looked too carefully into how people's perceptions of cold therapy in regards to pain. Whether there's been carvings of people icing body parts in ancient caves and things around the world. To be honest, I'm not sure, but my intuition tells me that for as long as humankind have been experiencing pain, we've no doubt been using things that are very easy to access and naturally make the pain feel better. And even animals, obviously animals are able to experience pain, and even we know that plant forms have nociceptive capabilities, the ability to detect danger, even though they don't have the cognition required to actually take that danger and produce pain. Again, I've not looked into the animals' habits around icing in regards to pain, but should an animal experience pain, then it's quite possible that they would find a cold environment to expose that area of pain to. Obviously, animals with higher cognitive processing. So it makes sense that for as long as we've been experiencing pain, humans will have been using some cold to address that pain. From a scientific perspective, the person that really popularized both ice but also the whole sort of RICE protocol was an American doctor named Gabe Merkin. And he wrote about this in 1978 when he proposed the RICE protocol, which is rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And since then, it's essentially been like a holy doctrine of acute injury management, that as soon as you hurt something, you put some ice on it, and that will decrease the inflammation and help with future healing. The sort of RICE acronym has been, I guess, updated and progressed as we've gone along. So we've added a P at the start, so you have the protection before the ricing, and then also referral at the end. So for a certain amount of time we were going through PRICER, where we would protect, rest, ice, compress, elevate, and then refer on. And then I guess in the middle of the 2000s, we had this change towards, or probably the middle of last decade, we had this change towards POLICE as an acronym. So POLICE stood for protection, optimal loading, and again, if you've listened to my podcast in the past, you'll know that load underpins everything that we do in musculoskeletal medicine. Again, if you haven't watched that episode, go back and check that out. If you're on YouTube, you can click the link there and access that. So optimal loading really is the crux of injury management, and even though most people think about loading as something you do as part of a rehabilitation program, it is also important in the early stages of an injury, and even from the moment that you injure yourself, the loading protocol starts then. Now, right at the time of injury, it might be zero load, but the structure in which we add load to the injured body part to progress over time really needs to start from the second that injury occurs. So we've got protection, optimal loading, and then we have ice, compression, and elevation. And that was sort of the POLICE acronym stood for a certain amount of time. In the last couple of years, we've had a different acronym proposed, and that is the Peace and Love acronym. Now, the peace part stands for protection, which is the same, elevation, and then the big one, the A, is avoidance of anti-inflammatories in the ice. And that's the one that's everyone's, oh, gosh, we're supposed to avoid ice now and anti-inflammatories as well. The rest of it, the compression, and then we have education. And as we know, education is a critically important part of any sort of rehab process, both understanding the nature of the injury, guidance on how to progress our rehab, but also reassurance and education about what pain actually is, and trying to normalise that painful experience so that we don't go into a catastrophising and things like that. The love part, we have load, which we've already talked about load before. Optimism, which I think is a great thing to include here. As always, obviously with some injuries are more serious than others and may have a somewhat negative prognosis, but where possible, we're trying to always see the positive side of an injury and try to stay as positive as possible. The V is vascularization, so trying to do whatever cardiovascular modality we can within the limits of the pain and the injury to enhance that healing process. And the last part is exercise, and that sort of encapsulates a lot of different aspects of the rehab process, but obviously exercise is a critically important process. So we'll go back up to close to the top where that A, avoidance of ice and anti-inflammatories. Now, the thought that ice might not be the most optimal treatment option for acute injuries definitely isn't a new thing. There was a book in 2013 by Gary Reinl called Iced, the Illusionary Treatment Option. Now, you might be interested to know who wrote the foreword for this book. It was, in fact, Gabe Merkin, the guy that 35 years earlier described ice as a critical part of acute injury management and part of that RICE acronym. And I think this is really good when this happens. It doesn't often happen, but when researchers or clinicians or scientists go back on previous findings and previous opinions, and in particular something like this that has had such a massive impact on the way that we manage injury and pain, for someone to look objectively at those previous findings and think actually now based on the experience that we've had and the evidence that's come out and our understanding of different mechanisms, can then go back and say, we were actually wrong about this, is a really amazing thing, and it takes a really humble person and someone that really cares about the appropriate application of science to actually do that. The theory behind why it might not be an effective strategy, essentially, when you're applying ice to a part of the body, it causes vasoconstriction, so decrease in the blood vessels around that area. And so it basically squeezes, it's like a hose where you're making the hose smaller and decreasing the amount of fluid that can get through there. Now, it does often decrease inflammation, and so that part of it is still an accurate understanding. However, it decreases some of the products that and the chemicals and the proteins that respond to the inflammatory process in a positive way. So when we have an injury, we have this inflammatory cascade where different chemicals are sent to the area to basically try and clean up. It's almost like how the immune system reacts to foreign particles. It goes in there and tries to clean up that debris. And then after that initial inflammatory process, once it starts cleaning things up, it starts to try and mend and rebuild that area. And so if we're causing excessive vasoconstriction of the area, then we're decreasing the ability of the body to send that important stuff into the area to initiate that cleanup process and then progress to the healing process. So in general, with acute injuries, we typically don't recommend ice anymore. Right? Now, there are some caveats, right? So it's not like we never use ice. Ice is, or can be, a very effective analgesic. So if you put ice over an injured area, as we assume that humankind have done for centuries and millennia before, it can decrease pain. Hey, so you're basically numbing the nerve fibers that are transmitting messages of danger up towards the brain, and therefore, potentially decreasing that painful stimulus. So when we have the instance where the amount of pain is disrupting other aspects of the healing mechanism, then we can potentially warrant the use of ice, even if it does interfere with the initial inflammatory process and therefore the healing process. If it allows us to get that optimal loading, which we know is so important, if we have, say, a sprained ankle, we're having difficulty weight bearing, but we put some ice on and that allows us to move it a little bit more, get that early weight bearing, and use that part of the stimulus to promote healing, then that may be a valid use. Same thing if it's if the pain is interfering with our sleep, and applying some ice helps us decrease the pain to the point where we can sleep, then that is likely to be advantageous, because we know that sleep is really important, obviously in general health, but also in the healing of injuries. So again, it's a little bit of give and take. We might be slightly robbing some of the healing capacity of the body by applying ice, but at the same time, we might be improving on other factors that help with healing and resolution of an injury. There's also the case where the actual fluid accumulation in the joint may be excessive, and that may actually be contributing to the pain. So when you have a really swollen knee, let's say you have an ACL rupture or a really bad ankle sprain where the joint just blows up, the swelling itself may be either restricting range of motion in a major way. Obviously, if you have an injury, there is going to be some decrease in range of motion, not only because of the joint sensitivity, but also because of that inflammation. And to a certain degree, we need to just sort of wait and allow that to settle down and improve our range of motion over a realistic time course. But if the swelling is too great and it's actually pressing on structures and causing secondary pain, or even pressing on some nerve structures and causing pain that way, then again, that's maybe an instance where we might apply some ice to decrease the swelling to more of a tolerable level, so it's no longer causing that secondary pressure on structures and secondary pain. If we're talking about like persistent and chronic pain, then ice may may have more of a place and may be seen as less detrimental. So if you've got a tendinopathy, for example, and it's been going on for a long period of time, it's not an inflammatory problem per se, and therefore you're not really impacting the healing process by applying ice. And if the ice makes it feel good, it maybe settles down the area after you do some direct loading to help with the adaptation of that structure, and it allows you to a better recovery and allows you to do that in a shorter amount of time, and therefore building up your capacity and your tolerance to load, then it can be again a useful adjunct. And then there's also sort of the placebo effect as well, and especially with children. I'll still get kids to ice anytime they've got an ouchie at home, because it feels good, and because they think it feels good, they know it feels good, and it will make them feel better. Had a very cute incident the other day where my 5-year-old hurt himself, and my 1-year-old actually ran to the freezer, got an ice pack and took it over to him. So they're already understanding those concepts, and perhaps that's part of why it is such a difficult thing to change in the minds of people, because even since we're very, very young, that's always been instilled with us. So I have no problem with using ice on children's injuries, even if there are acute injuries, because I think that the healing capacity of kids in general is so great that you're probably not going to interrupt that to a great degree by using ice. But I think at some stage we need to be a little bit more proactive with education and get people to understand maybe when icing is not perhaps the best alternative. I guess the other thing to talk about is like cold water immersion, and this is also something that is getting actually more and more popular, and this is where people will have an ice bath or a cold shower as a form of recovery. And ice baths in particular are becoming more popular and more commonly accessible through private and public fitness facilities, for example. So people see professional athletes doing their ice baths after training or games and want to mimic that because I guess they believe they're going to get similar sort of results or become elite athletes. And so I think it's also worth understanding the impacts of cold water immersion. Now, cold water immersion can be useful from a psychological perspective. Those sort of Wim Hof fans out there will talk about the combined breathing and cold water immersion tactics as basically a sensory stimulus. So you're basically waking yourself up with a cold shower. And for people that enjoy that, definitely not my cup of tea, but I know a lot of people that find that beneficial. And from a psychological perspective, if you're jumping in the cold shower for a few minutes, it's definitely not going to have any detriment unless it's so cold that you're causing ice burns, I guess. With the cold water immersion as a recovery modality, this is where it gets a little more complicated. Because it does help with recovery in a similar way to how we do how ice works with inflammation. It does decrease inflammation. However, when we're training, we do want some of that inflammatory process to occur for certain adaptations. So if we're trying to promote central adaptations, if we're looking at trying to decrease nervous system fatigue after a very neurally intensive training stimulus, then ice might be useful in that circumstance. However, if we're trying to grow muscle, if we're trying to make muscular adaptations in size, in muscular strength and endurance, then blunting the acute inflammatory response that happens after exercise may actually be detrimental. And we've got research to show that the application of cold water immersion after a hypertrophy training stimulus can actually blunt those adaptations. So I think it's important to understand that, but the other side of this is that since some of this research has become more common knowledge, there's people going the other direction saying you should never use cold water after training because it will completely crush your gains. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, when we're talking about blunting hypertrophy responses, it's a small decrease in the hypertrophic potential. And again, if you're not looking to gain size, say you're looking at strength training as a way to increase force output, and let's say you're someone who doesn't want to put on size, if you're like a weight division athlete, or let's say you're an endurance athlete where staying lean and keeping your body weight under control is actually advantageous for your sport, then it might be quite useful to actually blunt that hypertrophic response so that you're not actually growing muscle size, but you're still getting stronger. And also, if you find that the act of cold water immersion is just very relaxing, you really enjoy it, that's a great way to finish your training session, and you're okay with a small decrement, a potentially small decrement in the amount of gains that you make, then it's probably fine to use as well. So they're my sort of current thoughts and interpretation of the research in regards to ice as it stands, and I'm sure in a couple of years I'll probably do another update of this. As always, thank you very much for listening. If you do have any topics that you would like us to speak about, please let us know. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next episode.